Amen.
Well, good afternoon, Legacy Bible Church. It's Wednesday, and it is live and unscripted with Sarah. So, Sarah, you've got something you want to
I
talk about
do, and
today.
I am so excited to be here today, and I just am so thankful that you don't ever tell me you're not going to talk to me or answer my questions. So today you always say we're doing steak and potatoes, and I said today I'm going to hand you a plate of mixed up spaghetti, and you have to
Okay,
untangle it with no sauce, so it's not going to be easy. You have to really work for it.
we're going to try and unscramble
Yeah,
some
unscramble
scrambled
my.
eggs.
Okay, so let me set everything up. First of all, this verse that I've put in the comments and that I'm going to read today came up twice since the last Wednesday, and so I thought it fitting to um, go ahead and
Twice
talk.
in your week's
In my week.
experiences.
Yep,
Mhm.
yep. So
Hmm.
the verse, just I put it out there, is Philippians 2:12, and I'm gonna set everything up, and I'm gonna read both out of the NIV and out of Stout Ross.
Okay.
Okay, so here um, is what I wanted to talk about. I heard someone ask this week, is it right and purposeful for us to fear God? Us as in believers. Is it right and purposeful for us to fear God? And they set up two ways that we can fear Him. One, if there is sin in our lives, then we're afraid of God. And they brought up the scenario of Adam and Eve in the garden when they were hiding. And if we're so close to God, then we fear being away from Him, that separation that comes from, I don't know why we would be away from God. But if we're so close to Him, then we would walk around being fearful that we would ever be pulled away from Him. So I just was listening to it and I started thinking whenever I was younger and we talked about fearing God, it was always, I remember growing up in Bible school or Bible classes, they would say, we're not scared of God. God's a loving Father, but we have fear of awe and wonder and respect, that type of fear. So I had that in my mind as I was listening to this guy, and I was like, okay, this guy's actually talking about being afraid of God. And so I kind of just kept listening, and then he just threw out Philippians 2:12. And when I went to read it, because I always carry Star Ross with me, so when I went to read it, I thought, I don't think this means what you think it means, and I think that you're throwing it in there just because it has the same word fear. I don't think it correlates at all. So I feel like it's kind of a big mess, and maybe one thing, the fear of God, doesn't even have to do with Philippians 2:12. So that's why I'm telling you, it's a big bowl of spaghetti and I don't even know how to, but these are the questions. So let me read. I'm going to read out
Can
of
I
the,
ask you a question before you
oh,
read?
yes.
Did the subject of fear and trembling come up in the context of teaching a Bible teaching, or
Yes.
okay?
So the first time it was when we were talking, was in a, listening to a thing about Matthew 5 and all the blesseds are. And I don't know why it came up there. Someone brought up that we like to ignore the verse, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, because that doesn't sound fun. And I thought,
So it
well,
just sort of came out of the
that
blue
came
as
out
they
of the
were
blue.
talking about
That came
the
out of
Sermon on the Mount.
that came out of
Okay.
the blue. But then this one was when this gentleman was speaking about fearing the Lord. And after he had this whole talk about fearing the Lord,
And was that a topical discussion, or was he working through some scriptures?
no, it was just a topical discussion,
Okay.
actually before communion.
Oh, okay.
So then when he kind of just threw out this verse, it was almost like just throwing it out because it had the
Did
word
they
fear
take
in
the
it.
offering after communion?
Mm-mm,
Oh, okay.
they actually didn't,
Yeah.
that I know of. So, did we read it now?
Yes.
Out of NIV first?
Yep.
Okay, so Philippians 2:12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Stauros, which I wrote it down, but I'm still going to read it from here. Um, so then, my beloved, just as you always obeyed, not as only in my presence, but much more in my absence, with fear and trembling accomplish the of yourself salvation, For God is the one working effectually in you both to desire and to work effectually yourselves for the sake of the goodwill. So completely different. I immediately noticed different things. So I think there's going to be maybe two parts to our talk, maybe, if I'm understanding.
Mhm.
The whole idea of fearing God is something, and then
Mhm.
this verse is something else. But someone's trying to put it all together for proof texting purposes because it had the word fear.
Yeah, well, you want to just jump right into
Yeah, I
it?
don't even know really where you want to start because it feels like there's more than
Mhm.
just one question I have going
Yeah.
here.
Well, it's a concept that's very steeped in the Old Testament. And so when Paul uses it, work out your or accomplish the of yourself salvation, I'm very literal in to the point of being wooden in
Mm-hmm.
Stauros, the Wooden Bible, because really because of it's kind of my protest, if you will, against this whole movement for paraphrased
Mm-hmm.
translations, which are arrogant and presumptuous to presume to say that the biblical authors may have said it a certain way, but what they really meant, let me tell you what they really
Mm-hmm.
meant. And no, just tell me what they wrote. And that's what I want
That's
to
a good way
hear.
to say it. No, just tell me what they wrote.
Yeah. And so Stauros, the Wooden Bible, is more than any essentially literal translation, stays so close to the text that it'll sound wooden and it'll make you think,
Mm-hmm.
from
Oh yeah.
working through Stauros, and Stauros is just the Greek word that means cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could translate the cross, the Wooden Bible. But I call it Stauros because it's kind of a play on words with the fact that my translation is so literal, so close to the Greek text that it'll sound wooden in English idiom. And so to call it Stauros, the Wooden Bible, is kind of a play on words. So, okay. And so can we kind of jump
Yep,
into
let's
the
jump in and
meaning? Um, I won't do a detailed exegetical study, but you need to have enough to know that this is an exegetical question. And because so often preachers, they don't know how to teach exegetically, which exegetically just means you're walking through the scriptures.
mm-hmm.
You're walking through saying, here's what it says, here's what
Mm-hmm.
it means, phrase by phrase, verse by verse.
Mm-hmm.
They most pastors really struggle doing it. They don't like doing it. They're not good at doing it, and so they'll take those memorable phrases like, quote, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And without understanding A, the Old Testament context, and B, the New Covenant, New Testament context that it's being brought into, so that the Old Testament usage is being interpreted through what they call the canon of truth or the canon of faith, the rule of faith, that the Old Testament scriptures point to Jesus Christ and have their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And so they have their interpretation that way. So Paul writes in Philippians 2:12, accomplish, the verb would be kata ergetsamai. Ergetsamai means to work or to do, or loosely to do. But ergetsamai is the same verb that you get the noun, say, ergon, which you get energy from. In English, you get energy. So the verb ergetsamai is to work or to do. It's inferring activity. Kata ergetsamai is the kata preposition on the front of it, infers almost a very authoritative, a very intentional, a very enabled doing. So if ergatsamai is to do, kata ergatsamai infers somebody who's doing something who is very trained up for, enabled into doing, etc. So that's why Paul uses that there. Kata ergetsamai is almost, he uses that compound verb with the kata preposition, almost as saying, hey, you've been trained for this, you know this.
So when does he say that? Not as only in my presence, but much more in my absence, with fear and trembling, accomplish.
Accomplish.
Is that what we're talking about? Okay,
Accomplish would be the verb.
Okay.
That's the gloss for the verb kata ergatsamai.
Okay.
And the inference with that verb is why Paul uses the compound form of the verb, is to say you've been trained for it. You know this, you have doctrine for it, you've been trained for it. So to accomplish it, accomplish the of yourself salvation. And so the word salvation, always used in the New Covenant, the New Testament, in the context of the end purpose of God's salvation plan, worshiping in spirit and truth. And so the word salvation being used, soteria, or the verb sozo, being incorporated there, automatically tells you that we're in the end purpose of God's salvation plan. We're in spiritual worship. So the verb and the nouns soteria go together. Accomplish the of yourself, soteria. And the kata ergatsamai means you've been trained for this. You have doctrine, the sound doctrine that covers this. So do it, accomplish it, participate in this. And he uses, I think, the word obedience in there too, doesn't he?
Just as you always obeyed, not as in my presence, but much more my absence.
So the concept of obedience goes right to Paul's bookends on Romans, the obedience from faith. In Romans 1:5, Romans 16:26, he refers to the obedience from faith. Bookends on the book of Romans. Here, the concept of obedience is exactly that kind of obedience. The obedience from faith is then in the middle of Romans, which is your spiritually spoken service of worship. And so this is the obedience here. This is the kata ergetsamai soteria, the accomplishing or the working out. Or they often translate it as the working out your salvation. But I want you to know the verb there infers that you've been trained for something and you know something, so do it. And he's saying the something is effectual into the of yourself salvation. And so the salvation being spiritually spoken worship, the of yourself salvation is what? What do you think that might be?
Our choosing to obey.
The coming back to you as edification. And Paul is exhorting, encouraging, you've been trained up for this, do this. And Paul was always motivated, highly motivated, as we all should, who as we worship in spirit and truth, motivated significantly, because that's where our sound doctrine is protected, our faith is strengthened. We get good things out of that. And which is always intended, always motivated, that we'll come back into that end purpose.
So the of your salvation, the of yourself is describing, is like a more of a descriptive, accomplish the salvation. That salvation indicates speaking in tongues, because we know the difference. And if you go back and listen to any of our teachings, redeemed and salvation are not interchangeable in the context of the New Testament, no matter what you've ever believed or heard. Redeemed is when you have faith to believe, and salvation, we know, is when we're in the spiritually spoken worship, spiritual language, speaking in tongues. So accomplish the of your salvation, of yourself salvation is kind of, is of yourself more like a descriptive, like that's
that it's the adjective is, trying to think, it's the heteron. Yeah, I'm having a loss here for it, but it's yes, thank you. It is the reflexive pronoun. It's the pronoun that says back to yourself, is the pronoun that's being used there.
So when it says, "For God is the one working effectually in you both to desire and to work effectually yourselves for the sake of the goodwill." That's one other reason why
For the
it's
sake of what?
for the sake of the goodwill.
Okay.
When he's talking about that, for God is the one working effectually,
Hmm.
that's when he's talking about us
Hmm.
receiving back the
Yeah, that's out of the spiritually spoken worship. That's God working. We're participating with Him. We're cooperating. That's the obedience aspect. But that's God working effectually. And Paul is just saying, out of that, there's
you
the of
yourself.
yourself salvation, which is the reflexive pronoun, meaning that there's an aspect, a component of that, those spoken utterances that are for yourself.
Now, why does he say with fear and trembling?
Okay, that was your question.
Yeah, I
So
love
that
this.
gets back to the Jewish tradition. You can look at, say, Ecclesiastes, where Solomon said, the beginning of wisdom is what?
The beginning
The beginning of wisdom
is
is
the fear of
of
God.
God. That's right. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. This particular phrase that Paul used, and Paul was he's a former Pharisee, meaning he is a teacher of Torah, of the Hebrew Scriptures. He is an expert. He probably had more of the Hebrew Scriptures memorized in his brain than I probably know.
Yeah.
This is Paul the Pharisee. This is how they learned. This is how they kept Torah, was very significantly from memory. So Paul was steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures. Obviously, now with faith and with his relationship with Jesus Christ, everything was viewed toward the rule of, or through the rule of faith, as pointing toward Jesus. But the phrase itself about serving God in fear and trembling is from the Psalms.
Ah,
And I think it is Psalms 2:11. That yeah, see if you can pick that up real quick there. That Paul got that from. He doesn't just make these things up. He gets these phrases, and they're in the context, obviously through the rule, reinterpreted through the rule of faith.
Okay, so here, this is 2:11. Serve the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling.
With
So
reverence.
what NIV says fear.
Okay.
The NASB says reverence.
Okay.
The NIV
And
says serve
and
the
I
Lord
think
with
that's a
fear.
good indication there of what the fear we're talking about is. It's not an emotional fear, like, they say fear and trembling, but it is referring to acknowledging this this all powerful.
What about acknowledging they're saying that I love when we say he is God and we're not.
Mm-hmm.
We're observing when we do this, even though it makes no sense to us, we have no idea what we're saying with fear and trembling. So we're saying with reverence in this awe of he is God and we're not, do this.
Yeah.
And when
because when you operate in obedience, what are you doing? You're dying to yourself.
Yep.
In order to come into the presence of God, there can be no sin in the presence of God. And so because we're sin infected, we have to die to self. And dying to self, meaning I get my sin infected mind out of the way, and I participate, cooperate with God in these utterances that I don't know what they mean. They're unknowable utterances that I'm participating with God as an act of obedience. And this is the fear and trembling that was referred to in the Psalm 2:11, where it talked there about serving God, right? Which is in the realm of obedience. You serve God as a pure act of obedience. That He's God, He has given me faith to believe, and He wants one thing from me, which is out of the obedience from faith to worship Him the way He wants to be worshiped. That's it, church. He doesn't want a long litany list of doing things out here to make Him happy. He wants one thing. First off, He's already happy with you if you have faith to believe in His Son. God's happy with that. God's excited when a human being believes in who he is, that he's the Father, he sent the Son into the world to die for our sins. That makes God happy.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul said that when we will then, as an act, pure act of obedience that we owe to God, if we will worship in spirit and truth, Paul wrote in Romans 12:1 and 2, he said it 2 times, that it's well pleasing to God if we will do what Paul is exhorting here in Philippians 2:12, when he says that as an act of obedience, uh, um, accomplish or produce of yourself salvation, which that's the payback out of those unknowable utterances that come back, what Paul called in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, edification. Edification. We speak in tongues for edification.
So, Paul, I just kind of real quick while you were talking, read up Philippians 2:5.
Oh, you're in the kenosis passage there where Jesus emptied himself.
And he was obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
Obedience.
And so then Paul's over when he goes to 2:12, if I'm understanding correctly. So then he's encouraging them, just as you've always obeyed, when I'm there, much more when I'm not.
Yeah.
Do this.
Yeah.
Do this, because then you're going to receive and be edified and be encouraged.
Yes. And thereby keep doing it.
Yeah.
He's saying that the whole purpose of the of your self salvation, which is that portion of those unknowable utterances that are for your edification, are the very thing that's going to keep you going back into the participating with God in the end purpose of his salvation plan, which you get more of your self-salvation, and it's a circular pattern.
Okay, so do you want to speak for a second as to people, pastors, and just believers, when they try to pull that verse out to tell us to fear God as in the emotional, fearful, actual fear? Because the 2 times I heard it, when the guy spoke about it, when he was putting all the fear, and then the other time when someone just randomly pulled it out, he pulled it out to say, that's not a verse that I really like to talk about, because that's a hard one to sit and think about. We don't want to have to fear and tremble when we work out our salvation. We don't really want to do that. We want everything to be easy, kind of trying to make a spin on how salvation is actually hard, because we have to work so hard for this. So can you speak into that for a second?
Well, I guess I will say this. When pastors and teachers just simply, for the most part, do not understand the fullness of the salvation plan of God. They understand faith to believe, and they understand that we're justified from faith, and most of them understand that faith is a unmerited gift from God. The near purpose of God's salvation plan is largely understood in the church. But when you get into the idea of an end purpose of God's salvation plan, which is really the focus that Jesus had, the focus that the New Testament writers had, most church leaders, church pastors, most seminary professors are lost. They don't understand this aspect. They don't. First off, they don't speak in tongues, spiritually spoken worship, worshiping the Father in spirit and truth. They don't do it themselves. They don't understand it. And so all the verses that have to do with that dimension of God's salvation plan, they got to do something with it. And so when they come on a verse like this, accomplish or work out or produce the of yourself salvation, they don't know what to do with that. So that, in the fear and trembling part, and they're going to make very often this example that you're giving apparently would fit this mold. They're going to give kind of an emotional rendering of it, and often they'll even kind of get choked up themselves as they're teaching about it. I'm not saying it's not genuine. I'm not saying it's contrived, but I'm just saying that absent an ability to speak rationally about what the author is meaning. What's he doing there? What's his purpose there? What is he exhorting the believer into? Which is, for Paul in Philippians 2:12, is spiritually spoken worship. Absent that understanding, you're going to do something with it. You're going to make up. You're going to contrive a meaning for fear and trembling.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to say fear and trembling. Oh, what can that be? And there, I'm just going to say it in as literal, blatant terms as I can. They just literally conjure up, fantasize what it might mean, and they're very good at that. Very persuasive in using that type of, I'll just call it contrived rhetorical argument, where they basically make it up. They heard it from somebody else possibly, and they're just repeating it, but ultimately it's just a made up. We got to do something with it. Well, it's fear and trembling. Well, that's, that means I'm scared of something, and I'm so scared I'm shaking in my boots. And so we have to make up some kind of a meaning for the scripture that kind of correlates with that kind of emotionalism. But if you'll just read the plain words of the text, Paul's talking about a realm of obedience. Obedience is a realm of, I like the, when you read out of the Old Testament, Psalm 2:12, where you did a contrast between NIV and NAS. One was fear, the other was reverence. And I think that's getting much closer to Paul's meaning and Paul's use for it, is that obedience, which is what Paul's exhorting here in 2:12, obedience is out of reverence, out of respect, out of response to God, who he is, all powerful, all knowing, a good, loving God who sent his son to die for us and would give faith to believe, send his spirit to plant faith to believe while we're still enemies against him. And thusly, God reconciles himself toward us. And so Paul exhorting here, accomplish the of yourself salvation, would be the same thing as in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where he talked about God who reconciled himself to you. Therefore, you be reconciled to God. And so reconciliation is a two-way street. The near purpose, God reconciles himself to us, gives faith to believe. And Paul commands in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, therefore you, those who God has reconciled himself toward, you reconcile yourself toward God. They're two different things. They're related. We can only reconcile ourselves to God because God first reconciled himself to us. So you have near purpose and end purpose there. And that's exactly what Paul's doing in Philippians.
Okay, so I want to kind of wrap it up and I want to speak to our audience, and then you, if you have anything to add or correct, I want to hear. So what I'm understanding is I've given you all these thoughts and kind of just helping me sort through. First, the question, is it right and purposeful for us to fear God? I'm going to answer that. It is right and purposeful for us to revere, have reverence, have awe and wonder and respect, knowing that he is God and we're not. If you think of fear that way, then yes, it is purposeful, because we do not have all the answers. And sometimes, as you and I have discussed, we have to say, I don't know, you're God and I'm not, I can't explain it all, right? Okay, so that's the first thing.
I do that often.
So
that's just a reality.
That is, yeah, and that is, it takes a lot of faith to be able to just do that. And he's given us the faith to know that he is God and we're not. Okay, secondly, we do not, because he's reconciled himself to us, because we have faith to believe, because we are redeemed, we never, ever, ever, ever have a reason to emotionally fear, be afraid, be scared of God. Would you say yes? Agree with that?
Well, I would say yes, I agree with that, because at that moment when he redeems us, he becomes Father,
and he is happy,
and he's happy with us.
He's pleased.
If anything, the ones who don't fear God, who don't reverence God, they're the ones that ought to be shaken in their boots. But They have no fear of
I
God.
like that you just said that. Do you see the comparison with that? I love that.
But once God sends His Spirit and plants faith in the heart, He becomes Father at that point, and He reckons. He looks down upon us, and is no longer judging us for the sins that we still hold and might still do, but He looks down on us according to the faith that He's given us, planted in our heart, which, by the way, is the faith from Jesus Christ, and He reckons that as righteousness. And so God is happy with His children because they believe in His Son. And to those who have faith as a gift from God, God becomes Father.
And so the last thing I want to say is any one of our listeners that has heard this verse and has heard working out your salvation with fear and trembling, I want you to think for a moment what Legacy Bible Church presents through the New Testament, because it's a restored teaching. And we always talk and say that what the New Testament authors, what Jesus came to do was to make our yoke easy and a burden light. What has happened through the persecution of Scripture up until now is to yoke the believer with a heavy burden that there's no way for us to accomplish. We cannot redeem ourselves, be perfect, be holy. We can't do any of that. We can't heal ourselves. We can't do any of that. And so if anything, you can see how, if you've heard this teaching and they're saying, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and they're putting it on you, I challenge you to ask us questions, ask us to reread this verse, put it up there, and think for a minute, what is the difference between what we're presenting, where His yoke is easy, His burden is light.
Oh man, it's easy.
Versus what the church, the current mainstream church is of, work out your salvation, do it yourself, fear and trembling. You need to be fearful if you're not doing enough, if you're not doing this. It's two totally different concepts, because not only are we saying, hey, God's just asking us, requiring, demanding our obedience, and in that obedience, He returns and gives us so many things, the reordering of our thoughts and our faith, and just rebuilding and encouraging us comes from that obedience. And that obedience is the simplest thing you'll ever do, ever, because you can never accomplish all the lists. So I kind of just wanted to show the parallels there, that the mainstream church, a lot of the churches are teaching, work out your salvation. Well, guess what? You can never do enough to be holy, or to be holy is what the church is trying to. You're working out the salvation to be holier, because Jesus said, be holy as I'm holy. It's never going to happen. There's only one. No, I can't say that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen on your own. There's only one way, and that's when you die to yourself and worship. And that's what Paul's encouraging, not trying to scare believers into fearing the Lord and be fearful if you've done these things wrong. He's encouraging, obey, just as you always have. When I'm around, do it much more when I'm not around, and you'll get feedback and you'll be encouraged.
New Testament theology and teaching, whether it's Jesus in the Gospels or the writers of the letters, the epistles, Paul, Peter, etc., is, and I did a teaching on this last summer. I just felt convicted I needed to spend a Sunday just talking about the fact that regardless that God sent His Spirit and planted faith in my heart, I remain an utterly sinful being. And that one of the most important, and not to be self-deprecating and to beat myself up,
but just to acknowledge it,
but to recognize who I am and who God is. That God is righteous, I'm not. God's holy,
and
I'm not. But when I will die out of the obedience from faith as a response to God the Father for what He has done through His Son on behalf of me and on behalf of all who believe, as a response, He wants one thing from me, that I will get my sin-infectedness out of the way as a voluntary act of obedience, and come to Him and participate with him in bringing his salvation into the world, he'll respond every time.
Mm-hmm.
My response is an act of obedience, and God every time will respond to my obedience by consummating this spiritual joining where as a spirit regenerated believer out of the obedience from faith, God, church, I can't even hardly get my head around this, why he would use a sin infected person like me, but he will use me as his instrument of righteousness to bring his salvation into the world, some of which is the of yourself, Paul called it, the back to you edification. It's just too much to hardly. Now we can know that we can understand that because it's in the New Testament. And when the New Testament is rightly understood and rightly taught, it's just about that one thing. It's about God acting sovereignly to redeem a human being. And then out of that, the human being hopefully will learn good, sound doctrine about the faith and become a spiritual worshiper of the Father. And that's the one thing that the Father wants from his children. He doesn't want, the Father doesn't want anything else from his children other than be worshiped by them in spirit and in truth. That's it.
That's it. So if you're listening to any teachings that are requiring for you to accomplish all these things by their list, by their ideas, by their systems, I would encourage you to reach out to us, listen to listen to the teachings, because it is restorative of what the New Testament authors really had in mind, what Jesus spoke about.
And when the fog starts to lift and you begin to understand, you're going to say, "Wow, that almost sounds too good to be true."
It's too good to be true. I say that all the time. It is too good to be true. But He is God and we're not, and He fixed it all for us. So
all
that's
right.
it. Thank you.
Did we cover the ground you wanted to cover?
Yes, we covered it.
Okay.
We covered it very thoroughly. So reach out with any questions and share this with others because it's so exciting because it's so easy and so amazing.
It is easy and it is amazing.
It is amazing.
All right. Well, we're going to continue in James this Sunday. To those of you that listened last Sunday, our apologies that the sound didn't come. So I'm going to repeat the teaching that we did on Sunday and come join us.
Yes.
We'll see you then.